Welcome to this explainer. If you take a look at the 3D map right behind me, you're going to see this massive red vector. That represents traditional U.S. economic pressure pushing outward. But watch what happens here. It doesn't actually break its targets. Instead, it literally dissolves into these vibrant green pathways, a global 14-nation trade network flowing right around it. So let's dive into exactly how this happened. For 18 months, Washington deployed a strategy of intense tariff pressure aimed directly at Canada and Mexico. And the goal was simple, right? Force compliance through economic leverage. But what actually unfolded was an absolute masterclass in unintended consequences. Instead of submitting, these nations quietly triggered a structural revolution that completely bypassed the United States. A political system does not collapse in a single moment. It collapses when confidence disappears, faster than control can respond. Think about that for a second. That is the exact reality of what unfolded here. Washington's absolute dominance over North American trade didn't fall to a sudden war, and it didn't fall to a financial crash. It fell to a quiet, structural bypass. By the time the United States actually understood what had been built around it, it was literally no longer in the room. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Control. To really understand this shift, we have to look at the baseline assumption inside Washington at the time, and notice the sheer gap here between expectation and reality. The US assumed that Canada and Mexico needed the American market way more than they needed each other. Therefore, applying heavy pressure would keep them isolated and submissive. But the actual result? That identical tariff pressure actually forged an unbreakable alignment between them. The assumption just completely decayed the moment the pressure stopped producing submission and started producing convergence. Internally, the White House actually had a specific mantra for this strategy: discipline through disruption. And, well, they definitely got the disruption part. But this brilliantly illustrates their fundamental miscalculation. They assumed their leverage would hold firm while causing chaos for their neighbors. But while Washington was looking at two separate bilateral relationships, two distinct pressure points, it completely missed that its disruption was forcing those two separate points to merge into one unified system. Chapter 2: The Quiet Convergence. Because behind closed doors, Ottawa and Mexico City weren't bonding over political ideology. Not at all. They were acting on cold, shared, mathematical vulnerability. Just look at how this timeline builds. In month 1, both nations are absorbing repeated tariff shocks, completely disrupting their manufacturing. But by month 6, it's not the politicians talking anymore. It's senior economic officials and technical teams quietly exchanging information. By month 12, they're actively mapping logistics and drafting trade continuity models. And by month 18, they are completely rerouting supply chains. They realized, hey, we're being hit at the exact same points by the exact same external force. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that their solution wasn't some symbolic political treaty. It was a functional, logistical weapon designed purely for economic survival. The goals were clear and straightforward: avoid American transit, bypass American tariffs, eliminate US regulatory delay. They needed a way to just remove the United States from the equation entirely if they were going to survive the pressure. Chapter 3: Building the Parallel Spine. Watch the green vectors on the visualization behind me. This is exactly where the traditional north-south flow begins to sever. They drafted what's called a corridor logic system. Now, this wasn't designed to attack the United States. It was designed simply to function without needing its permission. It's a completely parallel framework governing how goods qualify for movement and how value is added across borders. It completely escaped the older tariff classification systems that kept them trapped in US dependency. Let's walk through exactly how this works on the ground, because it's pretty incredible. Step 1, you source your inputs in Canada. Step 2, you route those goods directly around American choke points, totally avoiding US transit zones. Step 3, you process those components in Mexico. And Step 4, export them directly to global markets. This sequence violently severed the traditional need to extend supply chains through the US mainland. And this right here perfectly illustrates the end of US customs dependency. Corridor origin goods. By rewriting the rules of origin, a product no longer had to be American-rooted to reach global markets. This single, quiet shift in trade interpretation meant the old architecture was officially obsolete. For anyone tracking global markets, this was the killing blow. Chapter 4: Industry moves ahead of policy. Because here's the thing, governments only draft the blueprints. Markets build the house. The absolute moment the math made sense, corporate actors moved. Major logistics firms instantly reconfigured their distribution routes. energy flows shifted to bypass U.S. transit. Automotive supply chains, which have historically been anchored to U.S.-centered production, started shifting component assembly stages southward and northward, totally bypassing American choke points. Capital just immediately flooded into corridor-aligned infrastructure. And that brings us to an undeniable truth in modern global trade. Policy no longer leads economics. It follows it. Once private industries adapt to avoid tariff volatility, once they get a taste of the efficiency of a frictionless corridor, political negotiations back in Washington become completely useless. The behavior had already changed on the ground. Chapter 5: The Global Trade Migration. Now, this is where the story absolutely explodes outward. What started as a bilateral survival tactic rapidly evolved into a global competitive infrastructure. The corridor created this massive domino effect, expanding into a massive 14-nation trade pathway. Third country suppliers realized the most efficient path into North America was no longer through U.S. customs. Japanese industrial firms were actually the first to formalize this internally. South Korean manufacturers quickly followed suit. Then, European exporters began recalculating their entire distribution networks. They all chose the new Canada-Mexico routing as their default entry strategy. And why wouldn't they? Capital behaves logically. Look at this comparison here. The American route offered policy uncertainty and immense tariff volatility. The corridor route offered speed, cost efficiency, and predictability. Impartially speaking, global capital will always migrate away from political friction and towards structural certainty. In global trade, execution is going to outrank political alignment every single time. Chapter 6: A New Structural Reality. This brings us to the geopolitical shockwave that finally hit Washington. When Canada and Mexico publicly announced their system, it didn't introduce a new reality, it confirmed one. The revelation did not function as the beginning of the shift, it functioned as its verification. By the time Washington actually realized they were excluded, the alternative architecture was already draining massive volume from their original system. The bypass was complete. 48 hours. Within exactly 48 hours of that public announcement, corporate risk models globally reclassified North American trade exposure. Investment analysts updated their frameworks across the board to reflect a reality where U.S. leverage was fundamentally and permanently compromised. Inside Washington, this created absolute strategic paralysis. Think about it. Raising U.S. tariffs on imports didn't deter corridor usage anymore. It just increased the economic incentive to bypass the U.S. entirely. Attempting to pressure allies individually, that just reinforced their mutual dependency on their new system. Every single corrective mechanism the U.S. tried to apply simply acted as an input that made the alternative system faster, stronger, and far more resilient. Ultimately, the entire underlying mental model of the system itself was challenged. For decades, the U.S. operated on the unquestioned assumption that it was the default center of gravity for continental commerce. All roads lead to America, right? But this corridor proved that North American trade could thrive and even optimize without converging on the United States at all. And that leaves us staring at a radically transformed map, and quite frankly, a fundamentally changed world. The green pathways are flowing, the red vectors are dissolving, and the old leverage is gone. Which leaves us with one defining question. If a dominant power is no longer the default route, how does it compete for relevance in a system it no longer controls?